man. Can you hear us? Hello. Now let's see here. Now we seem to be broadcasting. We may have lost all our whole audience now. How do we see how many people are logged in? Well, it looks like we are broadcasting now. If we go to the front page of Cannabis Culture, that'll tell us. Aha! Hello. Nice. Somebody can hear us out there. Are you guys there now? 20 viewers. 20 viewers on air. Okay, we're going. Excellent. Nice. And there we are on the front page. So it's finally working. I am so sorry about that, guys. Not sure what happened exactly, but Ustream issues. Anyways, so this is Cannabis Culture News Live. We're broadcasting from the Vancouver BC NDP Vapor Lounge, and I'm sitting here with Dana Larsen, who's the founding editor of Cannabis Culture magazine, and it has just put his hat in the ring to run for the leadership of the BC New Democratic Party, BC New Democrats, the NDP. And so I'm going to go down my big long list here that I already did before when you guys couldn't hear me, of many accomplishments of Dana Larsen. So Dana, one, of course, is the founder of Cannabis Culture, started it with Mark Emery, who he's a protege of. Let's see here, he's the founder of the Vancouver Seed Bank and the founding director of the Vancouver Medicinal Cannabis Dispensary. It's several locations. And you've also run as a candidate for the federal NDP before, and you've been very active within the provincial and federal NDP. And so now you've tossed your hat in the ring to be the leader of the NDP. Awesome. And that was just a couple days ago, press conference. And as I was explaining when you guys couldn't hear, Sihota, the president of the British Columbia New Democratic Party, just a few hours after Dana announced his candidacy or his run for leadership, Mo went to the press and said that Dana is ineligible to run as a candidate. With what we think is some erroneous information. He claimed that Dana was kicked out of the party before, when actually Dana resigned from his candidacy for the MP seat in 2008. We'll talk about that and exactly what happened there. And he also said that Dana forgot to sign his membership form, or he's actually not a member of the NDP, and had let it lapse or something like that, when Dana knows that he did renew his membership, and the same day, right after Mo said that, he renewed it right online. So Dana is indeed, as of this time, a member of the NDP, right, Dana?
My membership has never lapsed in the NDP. I've been a member in good standing under our party constitution since I joined the party in 2003.
Right.
And let me just talk a little bit about, I was the leader of the BC Marijuana Party, and in 2003 I decided I wanted to get into the New Democratic Party. It was the right place for me, so I signed up, and since that time I've been to every provincial and federal convention in British Columbia, and all the federal conventions, and I've also been to about 20 conventions across the country and other provincial conventions. Promoting an organization I have called End Prohibition, which has got about 1,000 members in it now across the country. NDPers who believe in ending marijuana and support ending marijuana prohibition and supporting drug policy reform. And people complain they can't hear the sound very well. I guess we're working on our little microphone here.
We lost
you can hear something out there.
We lost our parabolic dish. I'm going to see if this cuts down. Hold on, guys.
But
we do have a lot of background noise.
Yeah, let's see if that works any better. But I've been a member of the NDP for 7 years, and the party constitution states that any member of the party in good standing is eligible to run for the leadership of the party. And anybody who joins the party before January 16th is eligible to vote for the leader of the party or to run for leader of the party. And so I made my announcement at my cannabis dispensary, at which I'm a director. It's a non-profit society. I made my announcement that I'm running for the leadership of the party, and then a few hours later, Sihota, who is the party president, former MLA, and a controversial fellow in his own right, he told the media that I was ineligible to run for the leader of the party, that I was not a member in good standing, and that even if I was, there was other hurdles that I would have to overcome regarding my what happened with my federal nomination. And so I sent an email to Sihota. I couldn't get a hold of him by phone, so I emailed him and I explained my problems with what he was saying. According to our party constitution, a member of the party your membership is valid for 1 year after your most recent donation. And I made a donation to the party in November by credit card. I have I checked my credit card record, it's in there. And as far as I knew, that was to renew my membership. That is how any donation works for a member. But apparently the office did not process it properly, and it was listed simply as a donation, and then my membership lapsed. and that's very odd. But even if I have never been a member of the party, most comments still don't apply, because anyone who wants to run for leader of the party has until January 16th to join the NDP, and then they also could run for leader of the party under our Constitution. So really, my current membership status, which is entirely up to date, is not valid anyways either. So it's really a moot point that Mo is bringing up. And I feel that Mo Sihota does not want me to be leader of the party and is abusing his position as president to challenge me, my ability to run for the leadership. And his second point was about what happened in the federal election. And as you might remember, in 2008, I ran for I was accepted as a candidate. Actually, I was accepted in 2007, and I was a candidate in waiting for quite a while. And when the election was called in 2008, I decided after a week into the campaign to resign, because it seemed like things that I'd done in the past and my cannabis advocacy and the fact that I'm a marijuana smoker was going to become a big issue in the campaign. And although those are important issues to me, it wasn't a priority for the federal campaign. And Jack Layton's people, I don't think they wanted to be talking about marijuana through the whole campaign. And that's their decision. And as a loyal team member, I decided to step back so that I wouldn't be a distraction to the party. And that was a decision I made voluntarily. I was never kicked out of the NDP. I was...
punishment to anything happening at all was entirely a voluntary choice on my part to step back from my candidacy for the good of the party, so that they could focus on the issues they wanted to focus on. And the thing is, running as for the leadership of the party, the executive and the NDP doesn't have the power to screen candidates for that job anyways. They have the power to screen people for running for MP or MLA, and the reason for that is because those people aren't chosen by the whole body of the party. They're chosen by a riding association. And it's possible that the riding association might deviate from the general theme of what the party's doing into somebody that feels inappropriate. But the leader, the president, and the treasurer do not get screened by anything, because they are chosen by the membership at large, and as long as they're a member in good standing, it's up to the membership of the party to decide who they want to fill these positions. Mo Sihota never had to fill out a form or had to do anything to deal with his running for the president of the party, or neither the treasurer and neither is the leader. Those are all dealt with in the same part of the Constitution. So any idea that the executive of the party has any power to limit me or any other member that's standing for running is simply false. They only have the power to create rules. They can decide how much the fee is to run for the leader. They can decide how much you can spend, that you can't spend more than a certain amount of money when you run for leader. You have to have so many nominations and so many signatures and things like that. Those are all fully appropriate rules, but for the president of the party to come out publicly and say that a given member of the party is ineligible for whatever reason, it's not his decision. It's the wrong thing to say. It makes it abusing his authority. And I'm disappointed. And then Mo Sihota called me after I'd sent this email out, after he talked to the media. He called me in a conversation, and I said to him, "Whoa, why did you go to the media first? You could have called me. You could have dealt with this membership issue quite reasonably. I don't know why you're anything that he was sorry for going immediate friends without talking to me first, and he went to the meeting. But one of the immediate friends was wrong. He acknowledged it in our conversation. Used the words, "I'm sorry." And then we discussed other aspects of it. I thought we came to an understanding when I talked to him. He acknowledged that membership was now in good standing, and under the Constitution had always been in good standing. He acknowledged that I had never been forced or deemed ineligible to run for anything, but I made that choice myself, and there was no action by the party executive deeming ineligible anything. In our conversation, we agreed to both of those things in our conversation. So I put in a press release, I said, Sihota apologized for going to the meeting first, and he told me these things. And then now I hear that he's gone back to the media and said, no, I did not apologize, and that's not true. So I'm really bothered by his comments from party president. And this is why I think our party needs some democratic renewal. And if anything, it's reinforced my perception that I am needed for this party. And that our party needs a breath of fresh air and somebody that will speak the truth and not play these kind of games. Because I'm really just trying to run a campaign. I feel that I am as allowed to run as any other member. If you don't want me to be a member of the NDP, then don't vote for me as such. And if you do, then join the party now before January 16th. So that you're eligible to vote and make a real difference in this province. But I'm going to be able to run. There's no way that the executive of the party has the power or will make that decision. It will be wrong on many levels. And I have faith that my Democratic Party is open, is tolerant, is inclusive, and is democratic. And I sure hope they don't prove me wrong on next Wednesday when also, Dana, we're talking about the NDP and why you like the NDP. So why did you want to run in the NDP as leader? Why this time around, this year, and so on and so forth, right now, why did you do it? Well, let's just be clear. For people who believe in cannabis reform, the NDP is the right party for us. Now, the Greens have also said some good things about marijuana reform, and there's some liberals that are very progressive on this issue. There's even Scott Reed in the Federal Conservative Party, who's very progressive on drug policies, a real libertarian, one of the dying breed among the neoconservatives that Apple needs these days. But Scott Reed's a principled fellow, and there's many liberals as well, Marlene Jennings and Keith Martin and others in the Liberal caucus who have been very principled and supporting this issue. But the NDP, the federal NDP, is the only party that is consistently and practically at every level of the party federally has pushed to end the war on marijuana, has pushed to stop the extinction of market rate, has what the supervising injection say consistently across the whole party. They're the only party that's all them and the Black Chemical Club were the only two parties that voted against Stephen Harper's mandatory minimums for marijuana cultivation for other non-violent drug crimes. And so the NDP has been true to us, but at the same time, every single party has a lot of factions in it. There's people in every party that have different beliefs and different ideas, and you create a tent, and hopefully you have enough overlapping ideas that you can disagree or go along with the majority on other issues. And certainly there are those within the NDP who don't believe that marijuana should be a top priority. It's party policy, provincially and federally, that they support the legalization or the criminalization and taxing and regulating of marijuana. So this is not, it's just a question of what kind of priority they want to give it. I believe as an NDP member that our party should give it a higher priority. Others in the party think maybe it shouldn't be so high. And so that's what a leadership race is about, is deciding what the priorities of the party are going to be and what the tone of the party is going to be. I believe that I have a fresh vision for our party and for our province. Any Canadian can join the Democratic Party. If you're British Columbian, you're able to join the BC NDP and support me in my leadership race. I encourage all Canadians in any province to join the NDP. You can join at ndp.ca/join, or you can also just join the BC NDP at bcndp.ca/join. And I encourage you, if you don't like the NDP, join another party and get involved politically, because it's important to be involved in the political process regardless of what party you're involved in. But the NDP is the party for me. I don't regret for a minute that I'm in the NDP or that I'm doing this, despite the opposition I might get from people like Sihota once in a while. Poor Dana. So, and the opposition, I mean, you do have support within the NDP too. I mean, as you were saying, this is NDP policy. It's NDP, the provincial NDP's policy to tone down the drug war, to end marijuana prohibition, right? And so there's people in the party that you've been working with for a long time, that you've been friends with. It's just there's a few people like Sihota and maybe Brad Levine, and there's a couple others that's been the party with us that are the ones who are responsible for most of this. Exactly. The NDP, at the grassroots level of the party, I've had nothing but positive reception to my work in the party. I said I've been to over 20 NDP conventions across the country. I've met literally thousands of new Democrats. I've signed up hundreds of them to my organization. I've never had anybody come to me at any convention with anything harshly critical, anything negative, or tell me that I shouldn't be there, or that I don't belong in the party, that things that I'm doing are wrong. It simply never happened, and that's pretty phenomenal that that's been the case. And the only problems I've had within the party have been from people who I think strategically feel that cannabis should not be a high-quality issue, or that I personally am too controversial a person to bring it forward. But the fact is, I'm an NDP member and the same rights as any other member, and these people have to understand that we are not a threat to the party, we are a boon to the party. There are millions of Canadians who use marijuana, and we are politically active, intelligent people. The marijuana culture is a very politically active culture. We've started political parties of our own, for crying out loud. We have vast political organization and experience. We put on some of the largest rallies and events in this country. Our Cannabis Freedom Rallies, 420 in Vancouver, or the global marijuana march, also called the Freedom Festival in Toronto. It's tens of thousands of people. These are huge, massive events, and political parties are missing out. The NDP is missing out from tapping into that youthful, powerful vitality that the cannabis culture has in this country. And I believe whether or not I win this leadership race, just the mere fact that I'm able to run and get through this race and be considered a serious candidate will bring in thousands of people who want to see marijuana reform and will be happy to see the NDP tyranny as an accepted part of the party. It should not be treated as a pariah, or should anyone else who uses marijuana now or has in the past. There's a time not too long ago I thought I was openly homosexual, or if I was the wrong skin color, that people would say it was wrong for me to enter politics, and that it was too controversial, and I shouldn't be doing that. And now we accept very many kinds of people in our political system, but unfortunately pot smokers, current pot smokers are one of the very last frontiers of tolerance, and as a white male I can't really complain about being a part of the underprivileged minority, but the fact is that marijuana smokers and those who oppose for marijuana smoking are by far people who are underprivileged minorities, youth, and dark-skinned people and minorities, and groups like that are the ones who ultimately penalize the most for marijuana smokers. We have to stand up and say this is enough. The NDP's not going to stand for this. And I know that many in the caucus there smoke marijuana, many in the Liberal caucus smoke marijuana, many conservatives smoke marijuana. So this Liberal or others NDPers or lefties that enjoy cannabis, people all persuasions, all political stripes use cannabis, and we need to be accepted across the political spectrum, and the NDP is the place to start. It's time to come out of the closet, all you pot smokers, and really, Dana, I wanted to talk about some of the more controversial stuff that's happening, and this is part of the reason that I think that there may be some people who are afraid of the issue. It's because of some of the stuff, I guess, that you may have done for Pod TV when you were the editor of Cannabis Culture magazine. Of course, it's in this world we live in now where, Pod TV was one of the first sites out there that was doing live streaming video. Mark Emery back in 2000 started Pod TV, and it was one of the first sites on the internet doing constant streaming video all the time. And Dana had a show that he did all the time, and did tons of episodes of the show where he was doing controversial things like, taking drugs and having fun and recording what happened. So I used to do a show for Pod TV called The Reading Wednesday Smoke Fest, and probably some of you who are watching now saw some of those early episodes, and I'm not really ashamed of any of those things that are in that show. Most of the episodes is me sitting in my computer, my laptop, smoking a joint, or doing some bong hits and talking about political events of the day, and trying to show that somebody can smoke marijuana and still be very articulate and passionate and clear-headed about what they have to say. I did about 30 episodes, I think, that this is in the late 90s, like 98, 99, around that time I was doing these shows. And I did one show where I dropped LSD and took acid, something I used to do a lot more when I was younger, when I period from around 19 to 22 or 21. When I took acid a fair amount, I feel it benefited me. There's certainly dangers in taking LSD as you may done in a responsible way, and there's things like something to be done willy-nilly, but nevertheless, it's something I did and I enjoyed and feel I benefited from. I did an episode on Pod TV where I took some LSD, I filmed myself, I walked around my home on the Sunshine Coast and walked around, talked about my experiences, and depending on your perspective, it's either a fascinating look at the effects of psychedelics on the human mind, or it's a boring 1-hour rant of some guy tripping out and saying, oh, look at my foot. So it depends how you look at it, but I think we've all had experiences like that where we've been intoxicated in one form or another and had some said some done some funny things. Might happen to me in video, but so what? I think that was a very responsible thing. I don't think I did anything wrong there. And there's another video where I've got an unlit joint in my hand and I've been behind the wheel of my car and I see something about having a joint for the drive home or something along those lines. And I don't driving while marijuana, the joint wasn't lit in my hand when I had it there. At the same time, even if this is all what they say, and I'm an irresponsible person, this is before Gordon Campbell got arrested for drinking and driving. This is over 10 years ago. And we don't introduce Gordon Campbell every time by showing a clip of his mugshot when he got arrested for drinking and driving. So, I've made mistakes in my life. I've done irresponsible things in my life, as we all have. But I still believe that I'm an acceptable candidate for a party. These things that they're talking about happened a long time ago. I'm a responsible adult. I've made mistakes in the past. I've done some silly things. Let's move on, is my perspective on it. I know. But because it's on video, it's funny to be shown over and over again. But I hope we can get past that at some point and talk about other issues. And it was over 10 years ago. Let's just keep that in mind. And when the way they're depicting it in the press, if you go and read the stories that in the mainstream media that have come out in the last few days of Dana, they keep saying Dana was behind the wheel on LSD, and they conflate all these different issues together, and they really are trying to make it look like you were behind the wheel driving on drugs, when that is absolutely not true. I don't advocate driving on LSD. I have to say it's not easy to drive when the steering wheel's turning into a snake. I don't advocate LSD and psychedelics can be very wonderful, powerful substances, and many people have benefited from their experiences with these things, but people have issues too. They can sometimes be dangerous things. You feel that you're invulnerable, or decide to do things that are responsible. If you're going to take psychedelics, have someone there who's not using them, who can help guide you and make sure that you're safe, and do it in a responsible way, have it set up. These things can be beneficial, but they can also be dangerous as well, and so you have to do it in a responsible way. So Dana, let's talk more about your political history and when you started getting involved within the political process. You started with the BC marijuana party, unfortunately. I've been involved in politics all my life, really. I was heavily interested in politics as a younger man. I went to school and high school and college, and I helped found the BC marijuana party, and I served as leader of the party for a while until I left the BC marijuana party and joined the NDP. And although obviously I'm talking mostly about marijuana, and although I promote that this is an important issue, it's not the only thing I believe in, but somebody who works for sexual equality, or who works for racial equality, or who works to help feed the hungry, or who works in anything, doesn't mean that you don't have other interests, other things that you believe in. So I tried to build my campaign around 4 principles, and something I really strongly believe in is democracy. I think that Although there's no perfect form of government, the more you can spread the power out, the more you can ensure that people get a chance to vote and be involved, the better off you are. Decisions shouldn't be made by a little elite, they should be made by as many people as possible. And so I support in British Columbia we have a ballot initiative system to get referendums on issues. The only issue ever that's been had a referendum on before is the HSTs coming up since the first time something's gotten to the ballot. And I would like to see the ability for British Columbians to get more things onto the ballot so that we can have more voting on issues and less voting just for people. And so we gotta fix that system, make it easier for citizens with important issues to maybe only need 5% of the signatures each time instead of 10. Find some way to take this so that we can have more thresholds that more people are allowed to vote on issues. I also want to see more democracy within the BC NDP. I think the most comments in the way this new circle is trying to perhaps control this leadership race is a problem. I think we need to create a party that uses tools like the internet and other modern devices to communicate more among ourselves. Right now it's very difficult for riding association presidents to coordinate our resolutions and for party members to really get in touch with each other without going through the party apparatus. So I would, as party leader, I would strongly encourage an open-ended creating an open website where party members can communicate, can exchange ideas, can discuss resolutions, so they can develop policy at the grassroots level in an ongoing way, and not have it be simply something that happens every year or two at a delegated convention where you get to vote on the top 3 issues in your category. We need more democracy now within the NDP, now within this province. So it's one of the issues that I'm going to talk more about during this campaign. What are some of the other issues that are not populated? Well, I support the NDP policy on a lot of issues, and I like to see those policies really get into our platform. The NDP has something called Sustainable BC, and you can find it, I think it's sustainablebc.ca, and if you type in Sustainable BC NDP, it'll come up in Google. And this is a document, very comprehensive, explaining how we're going to keep British Columbia a sustainable province, and we have something left for our children and grandchildren, and we don't cut down every last tree, fish every last river, and dam every last stream, and don't think it's left for anybody else and for our children. The Sustainable BC is a great document passed unanimously by the NDP, and we're all very proud of that. And I think many in the party were disappointed with this document, and this ideology did not make it into the provincial platform. And an example of that is the Axe the Tax campaign that Carol James team launched. They were saying axe the carbon tax, and although our party had some issues with how foreign capital's carbon tax is being done, the fact is that Sustainable BC called for a carbon tax. So for us is to say axe the tax when our own party passed unanimously a policy that calls for a carbon tax is very confusing to the members of our party. And instead we should have had a more nuanced approach. Instead of saying we support a carbon tax, but the way Gordon Campbell is doing it is wrong. This instead. And that was a real failing, I think, of our party. And so I support making sustainability and Sustainable BC its cornerpiece or centerpiece of our policy in the next provincial election. And we bring this forward wholeheartedly and strongly. And that's another example of something. And then I also support issues like raising a minimum wage to $10 and indexing it to inflation. That's party policy, at least to raise it to $10, but I think indexing it to inflation would help to make it automated so we don't have to keep going back to it and forcing a big issue to get it pushed up a little bit each time. And I'd also like to see an important issue to me is sustaining our commons. The infrastructure, BC Hydro, BC Rail, BC Ferries, and our school system are all things that are being sold off or destroyed one way or the other by the Liberals. And they're all done in different ways, but the principle is the same, and that is handing over our commons to corporate power, giving away the things that our province has built that we all own in common as citizens of our province, and thinking that it's better off that these things be managed by private corporations, often in many cases multinational corporations that are no worthy people's province. I believe that's wrong. I believe that there's some institutions and some businesses should be run outside of government, of course, but key things like the transportation, like education, like healthcare, these kind of issues, BC Rail, Hydro, Forestry, these things should be part of our province. We should not be handing them over to these corporations. We should keep them, and we should reverse what has happened where all possible. And so that's one other issue that I strongly like to talk about, and I think is very important. So, Dana, I know in some of the media accounts that came out in the last couple of days, the editorials at least, there was comment from people like Bill Tillman, and there was other people that were sort of attacking you, saying you're a one-issue candidate, and that you've never really been part of the NDP at all. I've never seen, there was somebody on the radio, I heard Kurt Tusaw actually on the radio, and the guy called in and he's like, I've never seen him at any conventions, I'm who is this Dana Larsen person? He's just, this is all publicity ploy. So talk to them about what you've done in the NDP specifically, and you've been to a whole shitload of conventions all over the nation. Yes, I've been very active in the NDP since I joined. But first of all, any member of the party has the right to run for leader. It doesn't matter what your pedigree, it doesn't matter what your involvement is. Somebody can join today and have the same constitutional right under a party to run for leader as someone who's been a member since they were a child. It's no different. There's no hierarchy within our party. The NDP is a party of openness and tolerance and diversity and democracy, not a party of an old boys club where you gotta have a certain pedigree before you're allowed to run for leader. With that being said, I feel that I've been very active within the party. Since I joined in 2003, I have sought the nomination of my riding 3 times, and I worked very hard for Nicholas Simons when he was seeking his nomination, when he was the federal candidate and provincially, and I helped him a lot. I helped Edith Wilson when she ran as a federal candidate in our riding, and I played a big role in her election campaign. I have traveled twice in, I think 20 NDP conventions across the country, and I've met thousands of my fellow Democrats. I've spoken with many seniors and leaders of the party. I've been involved in very many ways. I've been involved in the executive of my riding associations as well, in various positions over the years too. And so I don't think anybody has the right to question my loyalty or my involvement in the party. But ultimately these questions are moot. Any member of the party has the right to run for the leader, and it's up to the membership to decide who they want for the leader. It's not up to Sihota, it's not up to David Schreck, not up to Bill Tillman. It's up to the membership of the party to decide who they want as leader. Those people are allowed to have opinions, of course, but it's not their decision. It's the membership of the party, and if you join the party before January 16th, then you also have the right to vote for the leader. You have the same right as anybody else. And so if you like what I'm saying, if you support the ideas that I have, and you want to see me do well, then join the NDP. Go to votedana.ca, go to bcndp.ca/join. Join the party. You can get a membership form at the BC marijuana party here at the Cannabis Culture headquarters, I should say. You can get a membership form on the day to receive day at any of my dispensaries or at any of the other dispensaries in Vancouver. You've also sent membership forms to other dispensaries and cannabis filling locations across the province. If you call us, contact our marketing, you'll be able to membership forms if you don't have a printer, you don't have a credit card. There's a lot of ways you can join. It only costs $10 to join the NDP for 1 year. It only costs a minimum of $1 if you're underemployed, and that's up to you to decide what your minimum donation is and whether you're underemployed or not. So $1 is all it really takes to join the BC NDP and to support me as the leader of the party. And this is an important effort, and your time is tight. You only have until January 16th. And after you join, sign up to your friends. Get them to sign up to their friends, because this is a numbers game. The NDP only has about 12,000 people in it. And we have a large network. There's more people in this province use medical marijuana by a large factor than there are NDP members, and we have the ability to play a huge role in the party and to play a huge role in democracy in British Columbia. And I'm here putting my neck and my energy on the line for this cause, and if you believe in it, believe in what I'm saying and like these ideas, then please support me. It's very easy to do. The vote will be by phone or by internet. You don't have to leave your house. You can do it all in front of your computer. It won't take you more than 20 minutes. 10 to join the party now, 10 to vote in April. That's all it takes, and you can help me create a massive revolution in this province. So please, do this now and get your friends involved. Go to Vote Dana and make a difference. VoteDana.ca. And so, and it has to know,